Yes, I think we can start. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's gathering, where we are looking at the title "From Fork to Farm: Zimbabwe's Food System More Sustainable." I'll just give a quick synopsis of the context, and before we have talk more about that. So, sustainable food system an important role in ensuring availability and safe, nutritious, and affordable food, in creating decent jobs and livelihoods, in contributing to balanced territorial development, and in protecting our ecosystems and biodiversity as a whole. Achieving these multiple systems goals is challenging due to pressures from climate change, changing demographics, and of course, we now have COVID-19 and other shocks. Discussions around the food systems have been topical at national and international level. It is important to get an update on the current state of Zimbabwe's food system. We have invited Anna Brazier to give us this update. After her sharing, we'll invite you all for a discussion where we'll discuss opportunities and challenges for the sustainable and inclusive transformation of Zimbabwe's food system. Thank you so much, Anna, for agreeing to give us an update on this, and I hand it over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Gertrude, and thanks to everyone for turning up. Wow, what a huge audience. I'm a little bit intimidated now. I hope I can make this exciting. So basically, I think most of you know that the FAO and CIRAD have joined together to do in-depth food system analyses in a number of countries around the world as a kind of preliminary exercise in support of the Global Food Summit, which is due to take place next week on the 23rd of September. And so here in Zimbabwe, we, a team that was FAO consultants and working with government and supervised by the EU, did a sort of 2 months, very rapid analysis. So it's by no means extensive. It's a very sort of preliminary overview of Zimbabwe's food system, but I think it's a first step. And the good thing is that we managed to identify some areas that need more research, which is really what it's all about. So if you'll allow me to share my screen, can I do that? Or do I need permission to do that?
No. Everybody can share. It's in the setting.
All right. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so it should be coming. Can anyone see it?
Not yet.
Yet, okay.
Yeah, no, it's set to all who can share, all participants. Yeah, there we go, it's coming.
Right. Okay, so this presentation is really the findings from the food system study. It looks at the analysis of the national food system, and that was based on literature review and stakeholder interviews. And then we also did a presentation to a number of stakeholders to validate the findings and to also come up with sort of solutions for the problems that we had identified. So I think Gertrude's already defined food systems, but just briefly, there are many definitions, but food systems are ways of looking at food, the process of food from farm to fork. So they're made up of elements and activities that relate to the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption of food. And it's also very much about the linkages between those elements and activities and the interactions. So a food system is a very valuable tool for looking at the way food is consumed, And it's becoming an increasingly used tool, an increasingly important way of looking at the issues surrounding food, are becoming more and more of a problem globally. So the more elements and activities there are between producing and eating food, generally the less sustainable the food system tends to be. And this leads to environmental, economic, social, and health problems. And the reason everyone's getting very excited about food systems is that COVID-19 and the climate crisis have really started to expose some of the negative impacts and vulnerability that's being created by food systems. So if we look at a very simple food chain, a very typical Zimbabwean food chain that would have been much more common sort of around independence, you can see that it just had very simple discrete stages. You could produce a similar diagram for many different crops or livestock even. But basically elements in the food chain of a simple rural community would involve growing the food, harvesting the food, processing the food, storing and transporting the food, then selling or buying food, cooking the food and eating the food. And these are the basic steps that we look at in a food system. But of course, food systems have become much more complicated, and the actual food chains involved have become much, much longer. So if we look at this diagram of a typical industrialized national system, which is basically most food systems in Africa, we can see it's got many, many more stages. And the arrows that are coming off, the different colored arrows that I've show some of the negative impacts, because more complex food systems become, and the more they depend on fossil fuels, the more problems that they have and the more negative impacts that they cause. So one of the major impacts that people are getting worried about is greenhouse gas emissions, but there are also lots of animal welfare issues to do with industrial production of livestock. Labor, welfare and equity issues. And then of course, a lot of problems to do with health and nutrition at the end. Can everyone still hear me? I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Great. Okay, so some of the impacts of the global system, I think people are extremely concerned about the health impact. So 4 adults are, worldwide are overweight or obese, and this is around 2 billion. So this is an enormous problem, and we know that overweight obesity can lead to lots of serious health problems, so create a very serious economic burden on nations and on systems. Also, there's a strong link between these conditions and COVID-19, which is one of the reasons that people have started getting very about it. 39 million children obese, and in Africa, over children under 5, the numbers increased 24% since 2000. Undernutrition is also very high in Africa, Southeast Asia. So clearly the food system is not doing its job. It's not delivering healthy, nutritious food. It's not contributing to our health and well-being. In terms of workers along the food chain throughout the food system, mostly are, of them are women, and there are also some children there. They're the lowest paid, they have poor working conditions and high exposure to toxins and other hazards. In terms of environmental impacts, we've got 25 to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from the food system, and some people consider that to be an underestimate. And it's a major contribution to deforestation, biodiversity loss, water depletion, pollution, desertification, and land degradation. So the food system in its current state is really not healthy, and it's creating a lot of harm. So we looked at Zimbabwe's food system, and this diagram may look complicated, but believe me, it's a lot simpler than the spaghetti bowl that it originated from. So I've tried to cut out a lot of the arrows and a lot of the words and just present it in a very simple way. This is the FAO's method for analyzing food systems. So in order to analyze the food system, we look at the core of the food system, which are the white boxes in the middle of this diagram. And in Zimbabwe's food system, we have, as a food source on the left-hand side, we have food production from agriculture. But wild food also contributes quite a lot to people's diets, particularly in rural areas. And this is an area that we need to do more research in. We need to understand exactly how much wild harvested food contributes, and also the nutrients that it contributes, because it's an understudied factor. From production, we go on to transport and storage, processing, markets, and consumption. And this core of the food system is impacted by drivers. So the colored boxes on the top of the diagram show what factors are driving the food system. We can see environmental factors drive the way the food system works, land drives the food system, infrastructure and technology, politics and governance, economic factors, and population or demographic factors. And then at the bottom of the diagram, you can see the impact. So the food system has environmental impacts, it has land and equity impacts, socioeconomic impacts, and food and nutrition and health impacts. So it's just a way of looking at the food system to try and understand how it's behaving, how it's working at the moment, and then what we can do to improve it and make it more sustainable. So in Zimbabwe, the food system varies, obviously. Our job was to look at the national food system, but in that process, we also had to take into account that this food system varies from household to household. So even in a rural community, households are getting food from different sources, and that's also influenced by things like education level, wealth group, social and cultural norms within the household. And it also varies from community to community. So social and cultural norms change the way people buy, produce, and consume food, and whether they're living in an urban or rural area. So the difference between rural and urban areas is very influenced by markets and transport. And if a community or a household is close to a transport network or an urban center or a national border, then it's much more dependent on imported food than local food. And that has a big impact on the nutrition status and other factors of the family. So when looking at the food system, again, analyzing the core of the food system, we have to look at the environment that the food system is in. And we look at it in the FAO system, we look at the production and delivery direct environment, and we look at the consumption environment. So in Zimbabwe, the production environment is very much influenced by agroecological factors. And this is why we divide our country into different agroecological zones, because different types of agriculture take place according to climate and soil in different areas of the country. The production environment is heavily influenced by resource degradation. So in Zimbabwe, we have major problems of environmental degradation, particularly of the resources on which agriculture depends, and this impacts the entire food system. Climate change is starting to have an impact, but mainly in terms of exacerbating pre-existing factors. So currently, the fact that our resource base is weak and farmers are trying to grow crops which are not appropriate for the areas where they're being grown is heavily exacerbated by climate change, but it will get worse. Land distribution and reform is a major factor influencing production in Zimbabwe, and this is to do with the colonial legacy of the majority of people concentrated in communal areas which are not suited to a lot of agricultural production. Then macroeconomic and policy factors are important, markets and pricing, the fact that we have very high poverty rates, both in urban and rural areas, and lack of rural infrastructure. These were factors that were identified as being very important in influencing the production and delivery environment. And then the consumption environment, we've got the influence of colonialism and globalization, we've got the influence of education and wealth status, and this has caused a for non-local foods, which also drives production. Production is related to demand. So there's also low status of indigenous knowledge, which impacts on production as well. Cultural attitudes towards livestock. So this may sound strange, but it's related to the fact that livestock's considered more as a wealth or as an insurance policy rather than a source. And people are very reluctant to slaughter livestock. And the consequence of this is that in parts of the country where livestock production is high, people tend to consume very low amounts of animal products. Gender norms are also very important factors. So the fact that women have a very high labor burden and they're very impacted by environmental degradation because of their traditional roles in collecting fuel wood, water, food production, looking after the family. So they have very little time to prepare nutritious meals and also to produce them. Food aid has a big impact on Zimbabwe's food system. So it influences what people eat, it influences what people grow, and it influences people's towards growing food. So that it's created a dependency syndrome, which has a negative impact on the food system. Zimbabweans seem to be very concerned about food safety, and this influences what they buy. The amount of time that they have and the amount of money that they have to purchase food is also very important. The availability of clean water, decent sanitation and hygiene has an impact, and the health and social service systems also have an impact on the food system. So that's looking at the environment in Zimbabwe in terms of the core. So the key findings for this study, my job was to focus on environment and nutrition and health impacts. So I socio-economic and other territorial impacts. So this presentation is going to focus on environmental, nutrition, food security, and health impacts of the food system. So in zooming into the environmental drivers, what environmental factors influence the food system? I've already mentioned settlement patterns due to the colonial legacy of land policies. And the result of this is that we have, although Zimbabwe is a large country and there's a lot of agricultural land available, the majority of people are concentrated in areas where the land is not very conducive to agricultural production. And although the land reform program has tried to address this, it really hasn't gone far enough. And population pressures are still a very serious issue in terms of environmental degradation. People in rural areas are heavily dependent on natural resources for their livelihoods. And this is partly because there are very few livelihood options in rural areas. There are very few locally based businesses, local enterprises. Rural economies are quite weak, as most of the money tends to get exported in the form of products exported from rural areas. And there are high poverty rates in rural areas. So this makes people increasingly dependent on natural resources, which are increasingly being degraded. The macroeconomic instability in the country has obviously had a huge impact on those factors and made it difficult for the government to invest in rural areas and address the environmental protection policy legislation. The policies are not bad, but poorly implemented. It needs to be improved as well. I think Gertrude has brought this up quite a few times, and the fact that it's inconsistent, there are contradictions within the policy. But the main factor is that the policy that is existing and the legislation that does exist is really barely implemented at all. In terms of policy implementation, the economy and operations, the private sector, take priority over environmental protection. So even though the Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Health try to implement their policies, if it comes to a question of economic growth, that will override other issues, and this leads to environmental degradation and health problems. There's poor governance of natural resources at national and community levels, and little enforcement of punishment for people who abuse natural resources. And there are also poor land management practices taking place at individual level, which lead to vulnerability and the increased impacts of shocks, which increase poverty and nutrition problems. So if we look at the impacts of these environmental drivers on the food system, we're getting increasing food insecurity, less diverse, nutritious food is produced, food is becoming more and more expensive, actually cheaper to buy imported than it is to buy local food. Poverty and vulnerability, decreased food production, and fuel, wood, and water are hard to access. And this is all related to soil erosion, soil fertility, increased crop and livestock pests and disease, increased dependence on agrochemicals, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, loss of grazing areas, increased desertification. Wetlands, wells, and boreholes are having problems. Siltation of watercourses makes water less available, and human and wildlife conflicts are increasing. So climate change is affecting these things, but it's exacerbating pre-existing problems. And the reason I keep making that point is that if we address these pre-existing problems, then climate change impacts will be much less than they are already. So looking at the food security, nutrition, and health drivers, inappropriate policies, again, leading to resource degradation, as we already mentioned, but also the dominance of maize. And this is a historical legacy of bad policies that really pushed maize as the major crop in Zimbabwe. And as we know, maize is not really appropriate for production in many areas. Okay. So this leads to low production. Sorry, can someone turn off mute their microphone? So low production, high food prices, food insecurity, vulnerability, and poverty. This is becoming a mantra that I'm repeating, exacerbated by economic and political instability, climate change, and COVID. Urban markets and rural areas close to borders are dominated by imported processed food. So diverse, nutritious food is expensive, particularly in these areas. And in rural areas, we're getting a sort of food desert situation where, because local rural markets are weak, most of the food that's produced is exported out of the rural area. So rural families sell their crops, but they use the money to buy less nutritious food, partly because there's very little nutritious food available in rural areas. The private sector and the informal sector and imported food is very unregulated. On the other hand, it's over-regulated. This was complaints from the private sector because of the food fortification legislation. And we've got this interesting situation in Zimbabwe where foods which are considered to be quite unhealthy by nutritionists, such as cooking oil and sugar, are actually fortified with nutrients, which some people argue encourages people to eat more of them. We've also got negative social, cultural, and behavioral norms, including the gender issues that I mentioned, the livestock issues that I mentioned, and food preferences. So junk food has very high status, whereas nutritious foods have very low status. There's a very strong connection between education level and consumption of nutritious food in Zimbabwe. This comes through in a lot of the nutrition studies, and it's an interesting factor. So the higher a person's education level, the more likely they are to consume nutritious food. So what are the food system impacts of these nutrition and health drivers? We've got multiple forms of malnutrition in Zimbabwe. So we've got micronutrient deficiencies, under and over nutrition happening at the same time. The stunting levels are going down, and our national average is 23.5%, which is much lower than it used to be. But some districts are really, really high compared to the national average. Counterintuitively, these districts are not Matabeleland. They are Manicaland and the Mashonaland provinces. So it's hard to understand because rainfall and crop production is higher in these districts, but they're consistently hotspots of stunting. If we look at Matabeleland North and Manicaland, household dietary diversity levels and the lowest household consumption of iron-rich and protein-rich foods. In 2019, only 6.9% of children received a minimum acceptable diet nationally. Only 6.9, and I'm afraid this has dropped to 2.1% in 2020. So we've really got low dietary diversity, and people are just not getting a decent diet in this country. In 2020, the global acute malnutrition rates in Manicaland, Matabeleland North, and Masvingo provinces reached the 5% threshold, which is considered to be a public health emergency. So really, there are serious nutrition problems in certain parts of Zimbabwe. And on the other hand, we've got an overweight and obesity problem. So men, the overweight figures are 22% and women 52.8%, and obesity, men 4.7% and women 25.3%. So this is very, very high. I know that there are nutritionists here and they will argue about the way that overweight and obesity are measured, and that's very valid as well. But there's clearly a problem with these things happening in the country.
Those are quite interesting figures, Anna. And I'm wondering if also try to move a bit faster to allow for the discussion. Only have 20 minutes now left.
Okay, nearly there. We're just going to flick through some maps. These maps show that stunting is not related to food insecurity. So we need to be very important how we talk about nutrition problems. They're very complex. And stunting is also not related to dietary diversity necessarily. So the stunting issue in Zimbabwe is a mystery, and it's probably caused by a number of different factors in different places. Stunting does correlate much better with population density and remoteness. So the densest populations in the country are also the remotest, and these are the areas with highest stunting. And this map shows in pink the areas of the country which are unsuitable for maize production. So we can see that from that although maize is the dominant crop, it's grown in a majority of places, it's really not suitable. Okay, so maybe we should just stop there now that we've got a list of problems and open the floor for discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna, for that rich presentation. And as you say, I think we want it to be a conversation. We want people to ask questions, to get points of clarity in areas where they need more clarity. And I just invite participants who are also sharing, if they could switch on their videos. I think it's nice to also have that personal feeling. I'll kickstart. There's a question in the chat box, and for those who also want to ask questions, you can simply raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button. And I'll start. There's a question from Jane. It's around the industrialized food system, the map that you showed us. So the question says, where is control concentrated in Zimbabwe's food system? Like, in your perspective, where is control concentrated?
I think control is definitely very much at the national level. And if it's even called control, I don't think it really is control. I think there's not enough control, and that's very clear by the way that we in particular have the environmental problems and this dominance of maize that has been a legacy for decades and has not been addressed. So the control is at a national level, and but in practice, I don't think there's much control.
Great. I see a raised hand from Jenny. Maybe you can come in and share more.
Hi, thanks for that. And Anna, I'm going to follow up on this question slightly because I think perhaps I chose my choice of words was poor. I don't necessarily mean control. I think perhaps a better word would be power. And what I wanted to understand better in that diagram that you presented was that it provided a sort of equivalency between environmental issues and political issues and public health and so on by having out in boxes. And I think there's certainly a relative importance to those very important domains. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about power residing in the Zimbabwean food system. And to put a more fine point on it, to what extent do you see the system being driven by government and public sector? And to what extent is this a function of either domestic or regional private sector interests? And I have a follow-on question after that, but I'll yield the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the government is the main form of control, but because it has actually given up control. The private sector have basically taken the opportunity to take control of the food system, and they're not. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad. Could take a positive role in the food system, but they're taking a very negative role, and they're manipulating the system and they're benefiting from it while allowing a lot of the problems to carry on. And I think your point about it being a regional issue is also very important. We tend to look at Zimbabwe as an island, but Zimbabwe is very much linked to regional markets in terms of supply and increasingly in terms of food imports and input imports. So yeah, I think the government would like to think it's in control, but it's also allowed private sector to take over. People who are definitely not in control are the farmers or the consumers.
Mm-hmm. I see a question from Maria. Maria, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for that very clear presentation. But I also wanted to add another dimension to Danny's question and also to Anna's response. I agree that the government is not entirely in control, but at the same time, I also feel that, like you said in your presentations earlier on, Gertrude, we have very good strategies and very good legislative frameworks, but the issue is making sure that they are enforced. If you look at the environmental policies which are there, they are quite okay, but nobody takes ownership or becomes responsible to ensure that they are also enforced, because it also feeds in, like you say, there are so many dimensions towards what is affecting the food security and nutritional security in the country. So there is really a lot of factors which need to be considered as well. And because of all these dynamics, even the local traditional leadership who used to have custodianship and being the responsible authorities for oversight of the natural habitants within their communal areas, they no longer understand who now has that authority to be a steward for natural resources within their immediate environs. Thank you, Gertrude.
But I'm not seeing any hand yet in the chat box, so I can come back to you, Jenny, for that follow-up question.
Yeah, okay, thank you, thank you. I would, my follow-on question, Anna, was this: is there any good news? I mean, you presented a very comprehensive picture of how everything's kind of not in terribly good shape, but were there any, and I believe I may be forecasting your next slide, we caught a glimpse of it there. But you know, is there any kind of positive gains? If things really have been on that trajectory that much for that long, then surely the situation would be considerably worse. So what's the good news here? Over.
There is quite a lot of good news, actually. Can I share my last few slides quickly, Gertrude? So we had the stakeholder interviews, and they came up with some quite useful and interesting thoughts. My presentation is jammed. Okay, can you see it, everyone?
We're on opportunities.
Yes, so these were the opportunities, and the opportunities are that we can build on the good policies, and there is definitely political will to address the situation. In many of the dialogues involving government were very open about admitting the problems that exist, and they were very clear about the problems that exist, particularly with diversification away from maize and encouraging small grains. So that's really a positive step forward. Devolution is a slow process, but which is happening, is something that we can really build on. The fact that stunting rates are going down in the country is also positive. And food and nutrition security committees and extension services, which exist right in the country, quite far to subnational level, can be built upon. Also, civil society, like many of the people present in this presentation, are pushing for agroecological approaches, food and seed sovereignty, and environmental protection. And the Food Festival, which is what we're building up to once again, is a very positive thing. Other people mentioned that the climate change and resilience discourse is a positive thing. Although climate change is a bad thing, it's really got people sitting up and taking notice of the problems that exist and starting to build more resilient agricultural and other parts of the food system. And there's also, as we know, a small but growing demand among the middle class for traditional foods and a corresponding response from the private sector. So there are some good things, and I think we can be very hopeful.
I
Over.
see 2 more hands. Pamela Richardson, Ngwenya, do you want to come in?
Hello, hi, thanks very much. Thanks, Anna, that was a really, really interesting and rich presentation. And I feel like you really communicated so much about like the complexity of the food system and the different factors. Kind of echoing what I think, is it Jani said about, there's a great sense of sort of heaviness in a way after listening because of the focus on drivers. And I do feel like when we focus on drivers, we do we start to see the system as very much kind of sort of determined and locked in. And there's a sense that the system, the food system is there's a lot of resistance to change. So I've got kind of 3 questions really. The first one is I'd really love to know, like based on the research and the study, what are the key where are the key leverage points in the system where you feel that there's the potential to create change towards greater sustainability? And then building on that, what do you see as the role of policymakers and the role of civil society or researchers in sort of facilitating change processes at these levels? What can we do? You know, where's the hope? Where's the way forward? And then I'm really interested in the role of like knowledge. I think people's knowledge and people's experience is often sort of died in a kind of systemic analysis. What do you get in terms of like the role of local knowledge systems, embodied knowledge, situated knowledge in the way the system works, and also in these leverage points for change? So yeah, like where are the leverage points? What can different actors in the food system do to support this transition or transformation? And what did you find out? What did you see about the role of local situated knowledge in all of this?
Okay, great. Well, in fact, the study did cover leverage points. And if I can just share my screen again, we looked at the actions that different actors need to take. So these were leverage points that were identified by the stakeholders. So government, obviously, we've mentioned, needs to review and upgrade policy and legislation and also monitor its implementation. And they did voice commitment to doing this during the dialogues. Government also needs to invest in the food system. So it needs to unlock financial instruments to open up different parts of the system. The government's very much focused on agricultural production. It needs to look at the food system as a whole and invest in all the different. It needs to back innovations to improve intensification. So this year, the government's really put its force behind Fumvudza, which is conservation agriculture. And the package that they've been promoting, although a lot of us don't like packages, the idea behind that package is to intensify production, which is in some sense addressing the population pressures in rural areas. And the response has been extremely positive, I think. So the government needs to back these innovations that we perceive to be beneficial. The government really needs to address population pressures in communal and resettlement areas. And although land reform is extremely unpopular in Zimbabwe at a sort of a public opinion level, something really needs to be done because it's absolutely dire. Extension officers need to be trained in promoting diversification and agroecological techniques, and this is something that can very easily happen, but it requires finance and resources. And reward or award systems, the way is done in Europe, where farmers are encouraged to use diverse cropping methods by being rewarded. And then you mentioned civil society. Civil society needs to empower people at community level to understand the laws that are supposed to protect them, and to help communities to put accountability systems in place. National awareness raising campaigns was mentioned by a number of people, scaling up successes. So there've been a lot of successes in development programs that need to be scaled up and that really have made big impacts on the food system in the areas where they've been implemented. And encourage more cooperation, learning and sharing, and research you mentioned as well, the civil society sector. A lot of people projects which are very good, but they don't share what they're doing, and other people don't learn from that. So it really needs to happen. Private's a bit thin on the ground with private sector, but we need to bulk it. Launch awareness raising campaigns to encourage demand for healthy products. There are healthy products out there, but people don't know about them, and develop more appealing products and convenience foods. And then the last one that was mentioned was what communities could do. And this was to ride on the back of devolution to develop improved local governance, service delivery, and local food systems, better monitoring and accountability mechanisms, and strengthening traditional environmental protection systems. So that's where your Indigenous knowledge comes in terms of building on Indigenous knowledge systems, and particularly traditional governance systems. There's a lot of will behind this, that it's really happening, it's really starting. There's been a huge move to gather and disseminate Indigenous knowledge. So I feel very optimistic.
Yes, I would like to bring more questions in and also get more voices in, and perhaps people who ask questions will be very brief, and you also give brief responses. Gigi, you have been raising your hand up and down. Do you want to come in briefly?
Yes. Sorry, yes, I've been debating whether I should say this or not. But anyway, let me go for it. You say there's political will. Now, we've seen what political will looks like. Within what? Weeks, we had new policies, regulations, funds allocated. That's political will in action. So is there really? I mean, I'm and I just wanted to ask you about what is the barrier to that happening? You know, how can we as civil society really help to break down that barrier and make that help the government turn that political will into action, which we know can happen in weeks if there is genuine commitment there. And then I just added to that is, you know, for example, to me, I mean, what percentage of our national agriculture budget is spent on the production and procurement of maize? We know in Zambia, that figure is 80%. So I'm guessing it's probably something similar here. And to me, that's like a no-brainer. Just immediately overnight say, we were cutting that by 40% and we're going to give that to support small grains and diversification. And that can happen quickly.
Gigi, I'll have to stop you now. So that a quick response can come from Anna.
Very quick response. I think that on paper, these ideas look great, but the public backlash when you do draconian things like you're suggesting is immense in Zimbabwe. So it has to be done gradually. The government want to cut back maize, but they don't know how to do it. So perhaps this is something that can have a focused support from civil society in order to help the government do it. They really want to do it, but they just don't know how. So that's where you can help. And of course, money is always the big help. There was a lot of money behind.
Julia, do you want to come in? You have had a...
Okay. This webinar caught me on the road, so I'm using an old phone. Put on the video, you won't hear anything. I'm actually parked under a tree. So thanks very much for a very informative presentation. I'm just wondering, what in terms of your consultation, because yesterday I was in a meeting where clearly the consumer, I'm a nutritionist and I'm also part of the problem in that I don't think we've done enough to increase awareness on nutrition per se, and people making the kind of choices even within their community of a healthier diet. Because yesterday, in terms of national diversity, we have over 100 things that can be eaten in this country. But of course, some are in one area and another, and how to make them sustainably available on every plate becomes a challenge. But I'm just wondering, in your view, what role you think an informed consumer and a consumer that is aware of the disease burden that is coming from our poor dietary habits, aware of the nutrients that are available even in some of the foods they're sniffing their noses at, because we haven't done a good job of promoting even some of our indigenous crops. What role they could play in actually transforming the food system? Because after all, we are looking at transforming the system so that it can produce food that promotes good health and nutrition. If we were to flip the thing over and start with the consumer, an informed consumer who can demand the system, who can begin to demand healthier food, I think eventually we'll plug that
Any
hole.
reflections, Anna?
Absolutely. I think that you're completely right. And there's been far too much focus on agriculture and not enough focus on consumers, and that there just needs to be more support. But I think what everyone's unanimously in agreement about is that it's not just about giving people knowledge, it's about behavior change. And behavior change is a lot more complex than just raising awareness. So there needs to be a comprehensive behavior change interventions, which is happening.
Great, thanks, Anna, for the brief response. Katarina, and then the last person will be Maria for the questions. Katarina, you have the floor.
Thanks. Sorry, thanks a lot. This is all this technology. Hi, I actually just very quick, I wanted to go in the same direction as Gigi. Do you see any possibility or any role for pricing, or like a different pricing of products, or like basically subsidies of certain products, you know, either by the government or maybe with the support of partners, to shift that interest in certain, you know, like to basically push rather than, or like pull rather than, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that more than subsidizing small grains, for example, which definitely needs to happen, we need to stop subsidizing maize. I think that is the crucial thing. We're never going to reduce the amount of maize produced while it's being subsidized so heavily. So the government has tried increasing the prices of small grains, but of course this totally backfired, as one of our stakeholders pointed out, because that meant that companies that were buying small grains to include in their products switched back to maize because the small grains were now more expensive than the maize. So it's a very complex issue. We need help. It's very, very difficult. Pricing is not something that's just an easy thing. There needs to be a lot of thought behind it.
Maria, quick question, and then we close the session.
Thanks. I don't think it's a question. I also wanted just to add on to what Gigi has said, that line of thinking, because if there's political will, it's not just about changing the price of small grains so that more people run for the producer price, but it's also about developing a holistic and systemic strategy, like what they are doing, for example, under the horticulture revitalization strategies and those other related strategies. So if they involve enough stakeholders and take a lot of people on board, it's not something which they just decide as government that if crisis, then all the other systems and synergies will come into place than that. So the political will also needs to be inclusive of collaboration among all the key stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Will is not enough, but at least it's there. It's better than nothing.
Yes, that's very true. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I want to thank you, Anna, for a rich presentation. I know we have cut you short. You had lots to share, but also want to thank participants in this meeting who have been very active. And I thank you so much for bringing those questions, and Anna for responding to them. Thank you so much. I think this is very useful in bringing the different perspectives and discussions so that truly as Zimbabweans, we come together, we join forces to transform our food system. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.